Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for staying back. I'm the last speaker in Australia. They call it the lucky last, provided everyone's still awake, but I think we've gone past that. My name is Bryan Moran. I live in Sydney, Australia. As Hannah very quickly picked up, I'm actually Irish originally, so I have a slight Irish accent, but having lived in Australia for a very long time, most of that is gone, and most of the work that I've done is actually out of Australia. I've been working in Asia for about 15 years now. I worked with a host of different organizations across Asia, across Australia, also in Europe. And the work that I do is based around ethics, values, and culture. And sometimes that deviates into risk and conduct risk, all of which can impact on the performance of an organization. So I'm going to share my experience with you in those domains. I began life in the corporate sphere. I had a corporate career for 20 years. Didn't really like the culture that I was experiencing, and so I decided to go and examine why it was that cultures can be different across organizations. And through that, I arrived at this notion of ethics. I think it's fair to say that most regulatory authorities, most banks, statutory authorities today recognize that they have a role to play in monitoring the performance of organizations, particularly in the financial sector. I have to say that DNB actually has a very strong record of intervention rather than sitting on the sidelines and waiting for a disaster to happen. They intervene in a constructive and positive way to make sure that directors and others who are primary decision makers are actually following the rules, but also staying on the guidelines. In my work across Asia, I've done a lot of work with organizations in financial services, and I'd like to share some of those experiences with you today. If I can get the slide to work. There we go. So, governments worldwide now have become much more prescriptive about this notion of ethics. I had a conversation last night and someone said to me, it's been said many, many times, you can't teach ethics. And my response to that is, as it has been for the last 20 years, no, but ethics can be learned like any other behavior. And so we have to make sure that we create an environment where ethics is on the agenda, ethics is discussed, and ethics becomes an everyday part of life. I'm glad that Bryain talked about stakeholders, because there's a lot of international research that shows that those organizations that manage for all stakeholders significantly outperform those that manage only for a narrow group of shareholders. Organizational culture, and I think this came through from Bryain's presentation, it's about human behavior, how personal beliefs, values, motivations, incentives, and systems interact. McKinsey some years ago came up with what they call the 7S model. The cold triangle, as they called it: strategy, structure, systems, and then the warm square: shared values, skills, style, and staff. And they concluded that in most organizations, the focus is very much on the cold triangle and not enough on the warm square beneath, which is how do we skill our people in decision making, and particularly in ethical decision making. Formal policies alone are not sufficient in promoting ethical behavior. We live in a connected world. The Internet of Things, and that is an expression that is still used today in the world of AI, means that more people now see how we do things, how we impact on others, and tell others how they should be accountable. The goldfish bowl of social media means we can no longer hide. Organizations can no longer cover up their indiscretions in the hope that nobody finds out. And even in the last 48 hours, we've seen an example of a major bank in Australia which has now been fined by the regulator $240 million for breaching 3 different aspects of the code. And again, they've been doing it for quite some time, so they must have been working under the assumption that no one would find out. Ethical behavior means ethics is essential to business. It can no longer be seen as an extra or an also-ran, or even something that we don't need to think about. There have been lots and lots of examples over the last maybe 10 years or more of organizations that have been found out. HSBC in Mexico, Goldman Sachs in Malaysia, Wells Fargo in the US, and more recently, Westpac Bank in Australia. So, stakeholder and internet retaliation is something that is real and that is with us now. So we must link ethical behavior to reputation. That's the most important point. How is our reputation likely to be affected by this? In some of the organizations I've worked with across Asia, we have actually been guided into conduct risk, measuring conduct risk and coming up with a formula for how they manage conduct risk, because that is the biggest single risk to their reputation. And they ask themselves the question, will this cost us in the marketplace? Could it actually undermine or destroy our organization? And those are real conversations that have to be had. The good news is we've talked a lot about AI, we've talked about changes in the workplace, we've talked about the fact that many organizations will be slimmer. The future generation will struggle to understand what it is that they have to do, what skills are required in this brave new world. An academic called Charles Handy once wrote a book, and in it he said that the focus of leadership, and let's face it, we are all leaders here. Once you employ more than one person, you have to step up to a higher accountability. And Handy said that the role of a leader is to empower their people. We must not make people dependent on employment. We must skill them in employability. So we have a responsibility to actually try to forecast the skills they will need, not the jobs they will have, but the skills that they will lead. And I know that Singapore has been a leader in this for quite some time. Culture is the key priority of today's success formula, and I will go on and talk more about that. It's determined by leaders and the behavior they role model. We have an expression, people listen with their eyes. They watch the behavior of the person immediately above them, and this is borne out by research. And they take their lead from the actions that they see from their leader rather than what the policy says. And so we have to recognize that if we want to create an ethical culture or a positive culture or a trusting culture, we have to also recognize that we are the biggest signal to the people whom we lead. We hear a lot these days about the tone at the top. Okay, yes, that's important. The boardroom issues that Vinand has talked about are critically important to the decisions that are made. But in culture and in creating an ethical culture, we also have to think about what is the mood in the middle? What do the middle managers think? What are they doing? What behaviors are they demonstrating? And then we need to know that it is echoed from the bottom. In one of the programs that we designed for an energy company in Australia, we did research right across the organization. It employed 10,000 people, many of them blue-collar workers working in depots, fixing lines, constructing poles, and so on. We went into the depots and we actually ran focus groups in the depots to find out what were their issues. So in designing a program, we had to make sure that it resonated with them. Some of those issues were about management. Some of those issues were about resourcing. Some of those issues were about the way that they were being treated by their supervisor or manager. We needed to hear that. And so that echo from the bottom was critically important to developing a program that would resonate with them. The other thing that I would emphasize is language is critically important. When you're developing a program, when you're designing a program, you've got to make sure that it is inclusive. You've got to make sure that the language is such that those that you are delivering the program to understand. And it's written in their terms, not in management speak. And so it takes a lot of preparation for us to get to that point. Whenever we're running, mostly I run experiential or interactive workshops in our leadership training, in our ethics training, in our culture training. And we use this device to surface managerial mindsets. We ask the audience, we don't have time today to do it, we ask the audience in their groups, in their tables, do you agree or disagree with these statements? Good people can act in unethical ways. That's quite challenging, particularly for leaders. Standards of behavior are different to societies. That notion that an organization sits apart from society instead of being integrated into society, that's also quite challenging. We say these are provocative statements. In medieval England, the word to teach meant to provoke. And so, as a teacher, I lectured at university for a number of years in sustainable enterprise. My role was to provoke my students to think for themselves, not to simply force feed them with information and then examine them at the end of a period. We can predict where and when people will misbehave. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you're actually going to put cameras everywhere, that you're actually going to accuse people of things. What it means is that I know enough about my people to know the external contextual pressures that might cause them to cut corners. And in that case, I can intervene to make sure that they actually don't do it, or that I emphasize to them what is good for the organization and what is good for the culture. Leaders set the ethical tone. I work with a government agency, and I asked the people, the leaders, the middle managers, and I asked them, how many times do you have an ethical conversation? Every week? Every month? Once a year? Never. Very few could answer regularly. But one leader said to me, I have an ethical discussion with my team every week. I ask them, how were you ethically challenged this week? Now, she's not putting them on the spot. She simply needs to explore with them the ethical challenges and risks that she faces that the leader may not have been aware of. We have an expression, praise the worker, blame the work. If something goes wrong, someone did not set out to deliberately sabotage the organization. They made a mistake, and often a mistake in ignorance or because of lack of policy or because of lack of direction. And so that's why it's a critically provocative question. Depending on courage for whistleblowing sets employees up to failure. I don't know what the situation is here, except for one particular case study, but the whole notion of having a robust whistleblowing program, policy, and system, I find it a very unfortunate expression. Whistleblowing. It just sounds so almost evil. When in fact, what we're trying to do is to find out where the system is leaking. And if you come forward and you say, I think we could improve this way, senior leaders need to have those discussions. When I was in the corporate sphere, I ran a company in Australia, subsidiary of a multinational. I instigated a general managers forum every Friday. And I would get all of my people together, in other words, the warehouse people and the clerks and the admin people. And we would have coffee and cakes together, and I would say, so tell me what you would change about this organization. I got so much positive feedback and information. We were able to change the organization's culture because of that. So, I'll move on and talk about values. This is the area that I spent 6 years researching. Personal values, organizational values, the intersection of those. If the people in your organization do not share your values and principles, then likely as not, they do not fit and they will not give you their discretionary effort. They are not engaged because the organization doesn't actually represent them. These are some of the red flags of poor culture and poor behavior. Absence of tone from the top. Am I leading ethically? Directive leadership style resulting in unstable and unplanned cultures. The directive, the command and control structure or system of management will no longer work in any institution or any environment. Culture of fear. Interesting, Wells Fargo is a very well-documented case study where people were driven to sell policies to, and products to people, and they had this euphemism, call it, which is 8 is great. Everybody was required to sell 8 new products every day of the week. What do you think happened? Of course, they invented products. They invented all sorts of products. And they put them in the names of their customers. And then the customers, of course, later found out that they were being charged for products they had never bought. And so when a whistleblower came forward and said, this is what's actually happened, what did the management do? Denied it and then blamed the people. They sacked 3,500 employees and said, you're the problem. But of course, the regulator said, I'm sorry, but you're the problem. And it cost them a lot of reputation and a lot of money. A simple compliance focus that assumes ethical decision-making. You can't assume ethics. Ethics is managed in the practice on a day-to-day basis. Contextual pressures. Vina mentioned context. We say that context is everything. If something goes wrong and someone makes a poor decision, find out why. What was the context in which? Time pressure is the most important. Pressure to meet a deadline. Pressure to please the boss. I thought the organization wanted me to do it. I thought I was helping my leader. This is from the Ethics Resource Center, and this is their research into why good people do bad things. And this notion of power distance. In other words, if someone is more important than me, I do not have the power to speak up and to raise issues of concern. And you can see what that would do in an organization. So, we look at systems and policies, critical that they're in place. Recruitment and induction, reward and recognition, performance management. We call those, and information systems, the 4 pillars of organizational effectiveness. Conflict of interest policies. Most organizations can't actually define what a conflict of interest is, let alone actually put a policy in place. And I've mentioned whistleblower policies. That's just the systems side of things. But when you look at changing mindsets and behaviors, the role of the leader is to design a culture that makes it easy for people to do the right thing. Competing values need to be discussed. When I was working with that large organization in 13 countries across Asia, they had, instead of values, they had a set of guiding principles, which were great. They were statements of principle. When we started working with them, they hadn't defined the behaviors that actually exemplified those principles. So we worked with them in shaping 5 behaviors that they could say to their people, when I say do the right thing, for example, it means this, 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 and this. So then people had a construct within which to work. Ethical decision-making is a skill that can be learned, but if it's never discussed and you don't train people in it, of course, it will be a happenstance. Business success depends on integrity as well as bottom-line management. Organizations can learn from their mistakes as long as they encourage internal feedback and create a safe place for people to raise issues of concern. The BP example that Vinand talked about, one woman was actually given the responsibility and control to shut the line as soon as there was a spill. She did not have the internal power to do that because she was afraid of recriminations. That's what we mean about creating a safe place for people to raise issues of concern. I worked with that energy company, 10,000 employees across multiple sites throughout New South Wales in Australia. And we wanted to develop a model for their ethics journey. And the left side of that model actually comes from marketing, and it comes from the notion of how to create demand from people. And it starts with unawareness. It doesn't start with awareness. If you're not having ethical discussions, if you're not talking about the culture, if you're not saying this is the desired culture we want to move towards, then people are unaware that that's actually on the agenda. And then it moves up the scale to understanding, because we've now defined it and we've now actually made people aware of it. Face-to-face discussions, group discussions, team discussions they're the only way to actually get across, rather than policies and procedures and emails and memos. Then they move to acceptance. They will then move to action, and then they will be committed to the enterprise. On the right is the whole notion of engagement. Think, I understand the rationale, links to awareness. Feel, I believe in it. I feel it's right. I am making it happen. It's the norm. They move up that scale. The more that you engage in discussions around ethics, and the more you actually engage in the development of an ethics training and ethics learning program. So, in conclusion, set out the purpose. People can only move towards a vision that they can actually see. Values, tone at the top, direction. Culture, the how and the why. It's not enough to say our target is value of new business if you don't then spell out what behaviors are acceptable in achieving that. Otherwise, you will likely have fraud. Role modeling, as we've said, and last but not least, the leader-follower relationship. How do we create a fair and just culture within our organization, working towards a goal that we can all see into the future? And how do we skill our people to achieve that? Thanks for your attention today.